We have looked at the main parts of the Abrahamic covenant, the promises, really, land, seed, and blessing, that these are what God had instructed Abraham to embrace, what he was going to do for him. We saw as Abraham moved into the land and was finally separated from Lot and fulfilling the conditions of leaving his country and his kindred and his father's house, that he shows him the dimensions of the land, tells him to walk around in it. And so it's a literal promise. We saw that it had eternal ramifications. I give it to you and to your descendants forever, and I give it. It's an unconditional gift. And we want to look today at how God indicated that and affirmed that through an Old Testament or an ancient Near Eastern method of making covenants or pacts. We noted that he said that he would make a nation from Abraham, and so through this one man and through his descendants, God is going to bring a nation into being. In chapters 10 and 11 of Genesis, we find the scattering of the peoples from Babel through the confusion of languages, and that marks the beginning of nations. And language has so much to do with that which binds a people together as a nation. And so God is then in a sense, obligated himself to work with nations, not just individuals. It's been individuals and families up to this point, but now with nations. And so he is going to create one special nation, the nation of Israel. And we noted that you need a common people, land, and then something that binds them together. And we will comment when we get to Moses or the Exodus and the Mosaic covenant, how that, among other things, serves as a kind of constitution. And that this program of blessing had universal implications, that all nations would be blessed in one man through this one nation, that they would be enriched and enabled ultimately to realize the creation mandate of Genesis chapter 1, that God would exercise his rule over the earth, over creation, through human beings. That was not untracked, but it was hindered and hampered in many ways, significant ways, through the fall in the garden. But God is going to fulfill that purpose and work that out. And so we've come that far. On page 32 of your notes, then we began to look at the Abrahamic covenant as in chapter 15, which is where the covenant is actually struck. And so they are the promises in Genesis chapter 12, and the intentions of God, the purposes of God, and Abraham responding to that will lead then to the covenant actually being struck. And we noticed that God, the Lord, is telling Abram not to fear, that it is not one born in his house who will be his heir, but one who would come out of his own body. And we noted then that though Abraham's heart was fearful, the state of Abraham's mind was one of confusion. We see a further development of the promise in verses 4 and 5, and then the basis for Abraham's response reviewed. God goes on to say, he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. This is going to be Abraham's inheritance. And he says, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? So Abraham wants a confirmation. He wants a sign. He wants it in writing, so to speak. It's one thing to have a word of promise, but he wants it even more confirmed than that. Now that's sort of audacious to say that to God, is it not? Isn't God's word good? Well, God's word is good. And God says that we are to operate on the basis of his promise, and he fulfills his promise. He keeps his promises, and that's what the whole Bible is about in one sense. But God also is willing and actually initiates on his own the entering into agreements with human beings through covenant, whereby God indicates, and in a way that human beings might, just exactly what he's going to do. And so he says, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. 5 different animals that could be used in sacrifice, that could be used in offering. And he brought all these to him. He cut them in 2 down the middle. He placed each piece opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds in 2. And when the vultures came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. Rather strange reference in Scripture. But what he's doing is he is preparing to the signing ritual of a certain kind of a covenant. And we have a number of different kinds of covenants indicated in the Old Testament. There's a covenant of salt that is mentioned in the Pentateuch and later on in Jeremiah, I believe. There's a covenant of, enacted by a sandal exchange. There's covenant and this blood covenant that is entered into here. And they probably have to do with not only various methods that would be available, but perhaps the seriousness or the potential of undoing the covenant. Some feel that the covenant of salt was, you carried salt around a little bag in the ancient world, so you had salt, and it was helpful for life and seasoning food and so forth. And if you ground up, a handful of salt granules and out of your bag and dropped it into your neighbor's bag, and he did the same, and those granules mixed together would sort of like your salts have mixed, and the covenant is as easily to be broken as taking a grain of salt out of the other person's, getting my grains of salt back. Whereas some think the sandal covenant is, as long as you exchange each other's sandals and keep each other's sandals, your agreement is intact. But if you both want to get out of it and you say, okay, I'm out, you're out, we're out, here's your sandal. I'll take my sandal. You can get out of it. You can break it. And so some feel that some of these different kinds of covenants have behind them the idea of this, how binding it is. And if that's the case, then this blood covenant would be the most binding because it had to do with the sacrifice of animals, and sacrifice always had to do with animals being killed in the place of a person. And so it would be the most serious and most serious ramifications. Maybe the idea, if you break this agreement, if you break your part of this agreement, then your blood is due to me. It's your life. We're glad we don't have to enter into those kinds of agreements when we buy cars or, houses or, anything. I mean, bad things can happen, but we usually don't get killed for debt in this country. So that's what we have that Abraham is doing. And so he takes these 3 animals and he cuts them in 2. I don't think he cuts them in 2 lengthwise, head on one side and the other end on the other side. He's down the middle, this way. That's a lot of work. Messy. All right? Now, Abraham is used to building altars and offering sacrifices to God, so this wasn't new. And then he'd lay the half of the bull here and the other half of the bull there, and he'd do the same with the other 2 animals. And then the birds said he didn't slaughter. Those birds were acceptable for certain kinds of sacrifices later on in the law. But he would kill them ceremonially and put one bird on one side. And so what you have is these paired animals having been sacrificed with a path between them. And apparently 2 people entering into a mutual agreement, a mutual covenant, a mutual pact, would pass between those pieces, and that's how the covenant would be signed. That's how they would indicate such. And of course, this is before you have paper and vaults and, where you can keep records of these kinds of things. It was all enacted, but it was taken very, very seriously. And so we find here the God addressing Abraham's uncertainty. And so in verse 7, he reminds him of his purpose. And Abraham then asks God for assurance of his promise. And God is happy to do that. And so he tells Abraham to prepare for a contract signing. And that's what Abraham is doing here in the sacrificing of these animals. preparing for a contract signing. And Abraham acts to dispel spiritual opposition. The birds in this case would be an instrument whereby the sacrifices would be disturbed to interrupt the signing of this. And all along, the evil one, Satan, is always trying to oppose God and hinder God. Now, I don't think everywhere in the Bible that birds occur, it's representative of evil. But in this case, it does probably indicate spiritual opposition. And so Abraham is involved to this point. Abraham is conscious of what is going on. And we see here Abraham doing his part in the signing of the covenant. But all his part involved, we're going to see, was the preparation of these animals. And so we do see God using Abraham, but we are going to see that this covenant is signed in a very special way. Now, what we're going to find is that God details Abraham and his seeds' futures. And so in verse 12, we see that. Now, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. Behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abram, Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And so we see God detailing this. Abraham is removed from the process. Whoops, I'm too far, aren't I? 12, no, that's okay. Abraham's removed from the process while retaining knowledge of the proceedings. That's important. A great sleep comes upon him, and while he is in this sort of trance-like state, God is telling him about the future. And so he knows what happens, he knows what all is entailed, but he himself is in this kind of state of trance-like state. The Egyptian captivity is predicted in verse 13. And in verse 14, the Exodus is assured. You know, your descendants will be captives, but after a certain amount of time, they will come out. Know certainly your descendants will be strangers in a land that's not theirs. They will serve them. They will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they will come out with great possessions. And so we see here that God is giving Abraham information about the future. And he guarantees Abraham's personal blessing in verse 15. And then the return to the promised land is assured in verse 16. So we see that God is preparing this contract signing. Abraham is involved with it up to a point, and then Abraham is kind of taken out of the picture. But even out of the picture, Abraham is being communicated with. These things are retained in Abraham's mind, in his thinking, in his knowledge. And God is revealing to Abraham just what it is that he is doing. And so, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. And so Abraham is assured of long life. Now, Abraham's already pretty old here. 100? No, maybe not quite. Close to that. But in the fourth generation, they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. We'll comment on that when we get to the Exodus and the conquest, and why it is that God was justified in telling Israel to go in and slaughter all these people that were in the land. God will allow the iniquity of a nation to grow only to a certain extent and go only so long, and then He will judge that nation. God is not unmindful of the nations. He is not unmindful of what goes on in the world. God is very much involved with nations. In fact, Acts 17 says that He is the one who's created every nation. He's determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. When God knows it's time to judge a people for their wickedness as a whole, He does it. And so we see here that there's an indication that when the nation of Israel will come back, some 400 years later, they will come back as his instrument of judgment. It will be a righteous removal of the people in the land. It will not simply be an unkind, I'm taking what is yours for me. And so what God is showing Abraham is that you're at this crossroads, this cross point of this far-reaching purpose that I have, and it's all running through you. What I'm doing with you here today, this agreement that I'm entering into with you, the promises that I've made to you, are going to have far greater ramifications than you can even begin to comprehend, though I am explaining them to you as far as I can. And so we see here that God details Abraham and his seed's futures. And then we find the contract actually being signed and ratified in verses 17 to 21. Came to pass when the sun went down, it was dark, that behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. On the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Now, this is the first time it says he made a covenant. There was promises before. I will promise this to you. This actually is the formalization of a covenant agreement in this chapter on the basis having to do with those things that God had promised he would do. Saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Now, the river of Egypt is probably not the Nile. It is usually thought to be the Wadi El Arish, which is the brook of Egypt, a little brook that flows sort of in the Negev, in the northern part of the Sinai. Even if it was the river of Egypt, that wouldn't be a big problem with me. It just means from the Nile, from the Nile over here all the way up through Canaan to the Euphrates. Remember, the Euphrates runs, at an angle, and so it would be basically giving the north to south boundaries of the land in that sense. And then he mentions the people that live there: the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cabanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, the Jebusites, and the Perizzites. Oh, wait a minute, those aren't in there. I forgot. Though most of those country peoples were parasites. But anyway, so he's very specific about what is going on. And so we find this this smoking oven and burning torch passing between. What in the world is that? Did Abraham come with a torch? With a pot of smoke? No. What's it stand for? God. Think anywhere else where God manifests himself this way? Yeah, the pillar of fire. And in fact, I think the pillar of fire and the cloud are one and the same. When they come out of the Exodus, it was a pillar of fire that led them by what? Night, and a cloud that led them by day. I think it was a large cloud-like thing that had a pillar of fire up in the middle of it. And what would stand out during the day when you've got the sunlight? The cloud. And at night, what you'd see is the glow coming through the cloud, the pillar of fire. I had a really interesting example of that in a refinery in Edmonton, Alberta. One early morning before dawn, I was driving to work and down through these refineries, and it was one of those mornings where every little bit of moisture turned into a vapor. And there was this one stack that they just had gas burning off. It's just part of what they do in the refining process. But it was burning off, and there was this cloud around it, and you could see every now and then the light kind of shining through, but it was just a big cloud otherwise. And as it would get light, you wouldn't be impressed with the fire at all. But while it was still dark and at night, that fire was just, glowing and illuminating out of the center of that cloud. And I think that's what the cloud fire probably was, leading them in the wilderness. It was God leading his people and going before his people. And I think it's the same type of an appearance here. Burning torch, a smoking oven, pass between those pieces. So who's walking between the pieces? God. Where's Abraham? He's over there asleep. All right? And this unmistakably is designed for us to see that this is an unconditional covenant. This is one of those grant covenants. This is one of those unilateral, one-sided agreements whereby God takes it upon Himself to fulfill the promise. There are no conditions that Abraham has to fulfill. Whatever Abraham has to do, he has done it before this. This is not a reward for Abraham's action in terms of recompense or pay. It's perhaps a reward for his loyalty. That was part of a grant idea. But God is just in no uncertain terms indicating that Abraham cannot mess this up. Abraham didn't have anything to do with signing it, so Abraham could not untrack it. It was God who was obligating himself to this promise. And so we see here that this passing between, it identifies the covenant, amplifies it. This is the signing of it. Now, the gift of land is restated a number of times. I've given them to you in your notes. And it's mentioned in chapter 12 and in chapter 13. It's mentioned here in chapter 15 several times that this is a gift. And then the boundaries of the land are specified. They are specified here in terms of true great rivers and some peoples. In Exodus 23, in verse 31, they are again specified. I will set your bounds from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, from the desert to the river. The river always means the Euphrates. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land. In Numbers 34, by the way, who do we have in view in Numbers 34? Think to the walkthrough, come out of Egypt, go to Kadesh Barnea, spies, come back, they come out, they disobey. What happens? They wander in the wilderness for 40 years while the first generation dies. We should have reviewed the walkthrough. Okay. So the first generation dies. So at the end of Numbers, what generation are we dealing with? Second generation. Good. That's what I was looking for. So when you get to Numbers 34, and there's only 36 chapters in Numbers, and he's talking about the boundaries of the land, he's talking to the second generation. And so he talks about the men who are going to divide the land up and how they will inherit it. The land boundaries are also given in Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is Moses preaching to whom? Israel, the second generation. And so this promise we see now has gone 400 years past Abraham to the first generation and then the second generation of Israel. And so we will see that this is carried on, that this does not end with Abraham. So what we find in Genesis 15 is the cutting of a covenant, the making of a covenant, the formal agreement initiated by God, the agreement signed by God, and He is the only one who can break it. Abraham can't break it, and God won't, because it's His word, because of His character. And so this is just a really, really important part of the Old Testament. And remember, this is foundations. This is foundations. Get this right, because the rest of the Word of God is all flowing out of this. The rest of what the Word says about God's purposes and where He's going and what He's going to do and how He is going to establish His order and His rule upon earth all flows out of this covenant. God is giving land to Abraham. It's real land. There's boundaries in the land. And He's going to give it to Abraham's descendants. And we're going to find as we go through the Old Testament that there are things now then laid on top of this, how it's going to work out. A king is going to come into a picture. And so God's going to make a covenant with David that will provide for a certain kind of ruler over this kingdom. And you've got the problem of Israel's disobedience, and it gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse as you go through the Old Testament. How in the world is this people ever going to get it right? Well, He is going to provide for that too, and we will look at the new covenant the second semester to see how it is that will play into God working His purpose out. But the Abrahamic covenant is the foundation from this point on of everything that God does. And so you want to really understand, and just giving you these 6 points is my way of just kind of packing that into your mind. Land, seed, blessing, literal, eternal, unconditional. Because when you get to the penthouse of our book, and they're talking about the land, what are they going to be talking about? Canaan. What used to be Canaan. Now it's called Palestine or Israel, depending on which side you're on. But it's still the same piece of dirt. And so the foundations are all right here. Okay, let's look a little more at the faith of Abraham. Yeah, don't do this. This is just kept going. Don't do that. Come back. It's God. You got it in your notes. Yeah, strategy according to the flesh. Ishmael is born, then Ishmael is gone. Yes. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I am God Almighty, walk before me, be blameless. I will make my covenant between me and you. Wait a minute. I thought he already made a covenant. What's he talking about here? Well, you will find a number of Hebrew words in this phrase, blank, my covenant. When he made a covenant back in 15, it's the word karat, means to cut a covenant. And it may have to do with this cutting of the animal pieces and so forth. Here, it's another word. And it probably has the idea of establishing or bringing about the full effects. And so don't be confused by these later references of making covenants. There's a difference between the original establishment of a covenant and the carrying out of a covenant. And so he is saying here, I will establish my covenant. I will bring it about. I will make it firm. I will bring it to fruition and multiply you exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked to him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. We have this very little interesting... here he comes again. There he goes. I got to go back and tell that thing to stop. There's name changes and faith challenges. There's a challenge to walk by faith in the first 4 verses. And he says, your name shall no longer be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham. Now, it's been Abram up to this point. I've been saying Abraham because that's what his name becomes. Abram means exalted father. Okay? Av is the Hebrew word for father. Ram or Rum is to be lifted up. So a lifted up, exalted father, Abram. Okay? So Abram is exalted father. Abraham, on the other side, or other case, has a meaning. Father is part of it, but it's father of a multitude. All right? So here we find God changing Abraham's name. Now, does Abraham have any children yet? So he's not even the father of one. Okay, imagine the scene. Okay, God appears to Abraham maybe at night in a dream. He says, okay, your name is Abraham. I want you to become known as Abraham. Now, how have all the people around Abram known him to this point? Abram. So he's walking down the street the next day, and his friend, that guy, says, hi, Abram, how you doing? He says, fine, but my name is now Abraham. Right. Where's all the kids? Father of a multitude. Yeah, right, Abraham. How old are you? And how old is Sarah? Lovely lady. How old is she? Yeah, right. Abraham. Let's go back to Abram. I can handle that. Abraham, that's stretching it. Okay, what's God doing? Call him, exposing his faith, calling on him to live by faith. And so he changes his name to indicate what he will become, a father of multitudes. And so we see here God not having fulfilled this yet, but he is on the way. We see the promises reaffirmed in verses 6 to 8. I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you, and I will establish my covenant between you and your descendants after you and their generations for an everlasting covenant. Again, everlasting covenant. I'm going to establish this, confirm it, bring it about to your descendants. And so this was not just an agreement with Abraham, but it becomes an agreement for his descendants. We see Abraham's covenant responsibility. What is he supposed to do in this? And we find circumcision being given as the sign of the covenants. Covenants always had some kind of a sign. The sign of the rainbow was the sign of the Noahic covenant. Very interesting when you think about it. You go to that passage, God says, when I see the rainbow, I will remember my covenant. I'll remember my promise. Does God have a problem with memory? No. But he says he puts the sign in the heavens to remind him to keep his promise, never destroy the earth again like that. See, it's the same kind of a covenant. God destroyed, and then God said, I will never destroy like that again, and I obligate myself to it, and I put the rainbow in the clouds to remind me. It's a sign to you that I will remember not to destroy earth. Now the sign of the Abrahamic covenant was circumcision, and that would mark these people out as distinctive. It would remind them of who they were. It would remind them in terms of maintaining a distinct identity. And so it becomes the reminder of Abraham, the reminder to Abraham, because they're the ones who would always be involved in fulfilling and performing the circumcision. It would just remind them that they were going to be the distinctive people. And this will be explained and brought out in Exodus in terms of this nation being a holy nation. We see the name of Sarah being changed from Sarai to Sarah. And Sarai may mean something like contentious. Biblical names, Old Testament names, often are great help in determining certain things. It's a little more iffy in this case. Perhaps Sarah is princess, but he's changing her name. It undoubtedly has to do with the same kind of characteristic or condition change that Abraham's name change indicates. We see Abraham's last gasp in verses 17 and 18, where he says, "Oh, that Ishmael may live before you." And then the final word is that Sarah will be a mother. Sarah will be a mother. Let's see. Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son. You shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant. There uses the word establish. Again, it's one of the different word than cut a covenant. I will establish my covenant with him. That is, I will confirm the covenant I've made with you, and it's my covenant. I'm the one who initiated it. I will confirm it to him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I've heard you. Behold, I have blessed him. I will make him fruitful. I will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. So you see here, very important, God's commitment to Abraham's descendants are on the basis of his covenant with Abraham, and promises which he alone guarantees to fulfill. And so we see here that that this is intended to extend down through Abraham's descendants through Isaac. Ishmael's going to be blessed. Ishmael's going to become a nation, but it's going to be Isaac who will receive the covenant promises. God isn't going to make a new covenant with Isaac. God isn't going to go through this signing process with Isaac. It's going to be announced to Isaac, but it's made with Abraham. And so you can see the far-reaching implications here. All right, so mission accomplished. Abraham responds by faith. Chapter 17, verses 22 to 27. Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised. So Abraham obeys that. Abraham is circumcised, and his son Ishmael, and all the men of his house, born in the house or bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised. So Abraham is responding by faith. And we then see the promise to Sarah amplified in this passage. And, specifically, Sarah, you will have this child. And so, just against the impossibility of it all. Sarah, by this point, was simply not, it was beyond just her inability to conceive. Her reproductive organs had actually stopped ceasing as well. So God had to restore those and then give her power conception for her to have a baby, which is, it's an incredible miracle. It's God saying, here's what's going to happen out there. There's no way you can see how to get there from here, but I will do it. And making this agreement with Abraham right up front before any of this began to unfold and could be seen. Now, I just want to go through quickly the promise of the seed fulfilled. This is on page probably 34 of your notes. And you've got it almost there. I just want to go through really quickly. We find Isaac being born. Now, as you've in Sunday school gone and looked at the stories of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and so forth, they are all full of rich material and illustration of a person's faith, of a person's relationship with God, of God acting on behalf of persons. And I'm not skipping that intentionally. I'm trying to give you the overview of what's underneath it all, and it's the Abrahamic covenant. How many of you have ever really been taught anything about the Abrahamic covenant in Sunday school? Okay, good. A few of you. How many have been taught these stories somewhere in Sunday school? Abraham, Sarah, Isaac. Can I see your hands? All right. So you can see how, as these are treated most of the time, they're in isolation from the larger theological context of why are these people there in the first place? Why is God dealing with them at all? It's because He's got a purpose for the whole earth that He undertook to solve through one man and his descendants, Abraham. And so I'm trying to develop the thread that helps you understand the whole of the Old Testament and its relation to the New. We find Isaac being born, Ishmael departing. Don't do this. Isaac offered up. And the covenant is confirmed by an oath in chapter 22. This is where Abraham is called to sacrifice Isaac, the promised seed, the heir of the covenant. And so it's not just a father being called to sacrifice his son, and that's often taught like that. It's the receiver of the covenant being asked to put to death the heir of the covenant upon whom all of God's program depends, by God's own word. And that's the only way you can make sense out of the statement or New Testament. Abraham counted that God would be able to raise him from the dead. And Abraham still was, abhorred with the idea of putting him to death. But it's all with regard to this, and God establishes, He says, I swear by myself I will do this. And probably by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, anything established. This is the second witness, or third. There's promise, then there's the making of the covenant, and then there's the swearing of the oath. And so we see God just being extremely careful about this.